Picture this: the air thick with tension, the marble floors of Rome's Forum echoing with the shouts of orators, the whispers of bribes changing hands, and the weight of destinies hanging in the balance. This wasn't just the center of politics. It was the stage for some of history's most gripping legal dramas, where the stakes were as high as life and death. The trials of ancient Rome weren't dry affairs of dusty scrolls and tedious arguments. They were spectacles of raw power, cunning manipulation, and sometimes shocking injustice. And here's the thing: these battles in the Forum didn't just shape Rome. They laid the groundwork for legal systems we still use today. Think about it. What if I told you that the tactics used by lawyers 2,000 years ago, the corruption that twisted verdicts, and the explosive courtroom speeches delivered by legends like Cicero all feel eerily familiar? That's because the drama of the Roman courtroom never really left us. Emperors rigged trials to silence rivals. Senators bought verdicts to crush enemies. Ordinary citizens sometimes found themselves caught in webs of deceit far beyond their control. And through it all, the law was both a weapon and a shield, wielded by the clever, the ruthless, and the desperate. So why does this matter now? Because these stories aren't just relics of the past, they're mirrors. The same forces that drove corruption in Rome's courts: ambition, greed, the hunger for power, still play out in courtrooms today. Over the next 37 trials, we'll unravel the scandals, the betrayals, and the moments of unexpected justice that defined an empire. You'll hear about the speech that saved a man's life, the bribe that toppled a senator, and the trial that exposed an emperor's darkest secrets. This isn't just history, it's a masterclass in how justice can be won, lost, and sometimes stolen. So let's step into the Forum and uncover the truth behind the gavel's fall. The 12 tables weren't just laws, they were a revolution carved in bronze. Imagine a Rome where justice was whispered in secret, where the powerful could bend rules on a whim. Then in 451 BC, everything changed. These 12 tablets, hammered into the heart of the Forum, promised something radical: transparency. For the first time, the rules applied to everyone, or so it seemed. But peel back the surface, and you'll find a system already tilted in favor of the patricians, Rome's aristocratic elite. Take the law on debt, for example. A plebeian who couldn't pay could be seized as a slave, even dismembered. Yet for the wealthy, a slap on the wrist. Then there's the case of Lucius Virginius, a plebeian whose daughter was stolen by a patrician's son under the guise of an archaic debt law. The 12 tables offered no recourse. Justice was locked behind a wall of privilege. Stories like these reveal the bitter irony of Rome's legal dawn. The laws meant to unify became tools of oppression. But here's what's fascinating: the plebeians didn't stay silent. Their outrage forced concessions, like the creation of the tribune of the plebs, a voice for the voiceless. These early struggles set the pattern for centuries to come. Every corrupt verdict, every bought judge in later trials, their roots stretch back to those bronze tablets. The 12 tables didn't just record laws, they exposed a truth that echoes through history. Justice is never just about rules. It's about who gets to write them, and in Rome, that battle was only beginning. Cicero faced an impossible task when he stood against Vez, a man so wealthy, so entrenched in Rome's power structure, that most thought him immune to justice. The governor of Sicily had spent 3 years treating the island like his personal treasury, looting temples, extorting farmers, even seizing priceless artworks under the flimsiest pretenses. But Vez underestimated one thing: Cicero's genius for turning a courtroom into a theater of outrage. The trial began with a masterstroke. Instead of delivering long-winded arguments, Cicero called witnesses immediately: ship captains who'd transported stolen goods, Sicilian nobles stripped of their inheritances, artists forced to forge receipts under threat. Each testimony was a hammer blow, chipping away at Vez's veneer of respectability. Then came the physical evidence: statues with chipped bases where Vez's men had pried them loose, account books with suspicious gaps, even a silver platter one witness tearfully identified as his family's heirloom. Cicero didn't just present proof, he staged it, making the jury feel the weight of every crime. But his real weapon was timing. Rome was simmering with anger over corruption, and Cicero channeled that fury into every word. When he described Vez's mockery of justice, how he'd acquitted a friend by accepting a bronze statue as payment, the crowd's gasps echoed through the forum. The climax came with Cicero's daring gamble. He rested his case after just 50 days, denying Vez's lawyers the chance to drag out proceedings. The message was clear: the truth needed no delay. The verdict: exile. Vez fled before the final sentence, his fortune worthless against the tide of public shame. Cicero's victory proved something revolutionary. In the right hands, words could topple giants. Yet beneath the triumph lay a darker lesson. Without Cicero's brilliance, Vez might never have faced consequences at all. The system hadn't worked. It took one extraordinary man to make it bend toward justice. And that, perhaps, was Rome's greatest legal paradox. The Catalan Conspiracy wasn't just a trial, it was a crack in Rome's foundation. Picture the scene: senators packed shoulder to shoulder in the Temple of Concord, torches flickering against the marble as Cicero stood to speak. His voice didn't just accuse, it trembled with what he called the death knell of the Republic. Catalan, a charismatic nobleman turned radical, had been caught plotting to burn the city, assassinate consuls, and rally an army of debt-ridden outcasts. But here's where the trial twisted into something darker. Cicero didn't just want Catalan punished, he demanded execution without a formal verdict, no defense. No delay, just the blade, and that's when Julius Caesar rose to object. Imagine the tension as Rome's future dictator, then just a young populist, argued mercy wasn't weakness, it was the law. Exile, not death, he insisted. The Senate's own precedents forbade killing citizens without trial, but Cato the Younger, fire in his eyes, countered with brutal logic. When the city burns, does one worry about sparks? The vote split Rome's elite down the middle. In the end, fear won. Catalan's co-conspirators were strangled in the Tullianum dungeon before sunset, their bodies left to stiffen in the open forum as a warning. But here's the tragedy no one foresaw. The real conspiracy wasn't Catalan's, it was how easily Rome abandoned its own principles. Cicero's triumph became his shame. He'd saved the Republic by breaking its laws, setting a lethal precedent. Emergency justified tyranny. Within years, Caesar would use that same logic to cross the Rubicon. The trial didn't just end lives, it ended an era. Because once justice becomes a sword, everyone lives in fear of the next swing. Clodius and Cicero's feud wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a wildfire that scorched Rome's legal landscape. The spark, a scandal that would make even modern tabloids blush. Clodius, a young aristocrat with a taste for chaos, once snuck into a women-only religious ceremony disguised in a veil. When caught, he turned to the courts, bribing his way to an acquittal. But Cicero, ever the moralist, testified against him, exposing the farce. From that moment, their rivalry became a blood sport fought with laws instead of swords. Clodius played the long game. Elected as tribune, he wielded populist rage like a weapon, passing a law specifically targeting Cicero: exile for anyone who executed Roman citizens without trial. a direct jab at Cicero's handling of the Catalan conspirators. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Cicero fled to Greece, his villas looted, his legacy in ruins. But here's where the story twists. Clodius overreached. His street gangs, the Collegia, turned the Forum into a battleground, assaulting senators and burning buildings, including Cicero's own home. The very violence that cemented his power began to erode it. Then came Cicero's counterstroke. With Pompey's backing, the Senate recalled him, and he returned not with meekness but vengeance. In speeches that crackled with fury, he painted Clodius as a madman who turned law into mob rule. The climax, a trial where Cicero defended Clodius' enemy, Milo, after Clodius was mysteriously killed in a roadside brawl. Cicero's argument was brutal. Clodius' death wasn't murder, it was Rome's deliverance. The jury, weary of chaos, acquitted Milo, but the real lesson lay in the wreckage. Their feud exposed how easily justice could become a puppet of personal vendettas. Clodius used the courts to exile a foe. Cicero used them to justify a corpse. In the end, neither man won. The Republic, already teetering, slipped closer to collapse. Because when law becomes a weapon, everyone loses. The streets of Rome ran red the day Clodius died, not in some noble duel, but in a squalid brawl that began over a baggage train. When Milo's entourage clashed with Clodius' gang on the Appian Way, what started as shoves escalated to swords, and by nightfall, one of Rome's most notorious firebrands lay dead in a roadside tavern. But the real spectacle began in the Forum, where the trial that followed wasn't about truth. It was about who controlled the narrative. Pompey, Rome's de facto strongman, made his stance clear from the start. His soldiers ringed the courthouse, their armor glinting in the sun, an unspoken threat to any juror brave enough to consider acquittal. Witnesses vanished or changed their stories overnight. Even Cicero, usually so confident in his words, faltered. His defense of Milo, later hailed as a masterpiece, was delivered under the palpable weight of intimidation. The famous line he should have uttered, "Let justice be done though the heavens fall," was replaced by nervous glances toward Pompey's enforcers. And here's the chilling twist: Milo's guilt wasn't even the point. The prosecution didn't bother proving he struck the fatal blow. Instead, they framed the trial as a referendum on chaos itself. Clodius, for all his crimes, had been a Roman citizen. His death, they argued, was an attack on the social order. Never mind that Clodius had spent years undermining that very order with his street gangs and arson. The law in that moment became a prop. The verdict was inevitable. Exile for Milo, a verdict less about punishment than about sending a message. Rome's strongmen would decide what justice looked like, but the trial's legacy was darker still. It revealed a truth no one dared say aloud. When soldiers outnumber scribes in a courtroom, the law is just another weapon, and in that realization lay the Republic's doom. Because once power flows from the edge of a sword, even the grandest legal traditions crumble to dust. Julius Caesar's rise didn't begin on a battlefield. It was forged in the shadow of courtrooms, where he learned to wield the law like a dagger. His first brush with legal jeopardy came early, when he was hauled before a tribunal for extortion during his governorship in Spain. The charges were serious enough to end a lesser man's career, but Caesar did something unexpected. He turned the trial into a spectacle. Instead of denying the accusations, he dazzled the jury with his oratory, invoking his family's storied past and Rome's gratitude for his military service. By the time he finished, the question wasn't whether he'd taken bribes. It was whether Rome could afford to lose such a charismatic leader. The case collapsed, but the lesson stuck. In the right hands, the law wasn't a barrier. It was a tool, and what a tool it became. As consul, Caesar pushed through land reforms by exploiting a loophole requiring senators to swear allegiance to his laws or face exile. When opponents cried foul, he simply bypassed the Senate altogether, taking his proposals directly to the popular assemblies. But his masterstroke came later as dictator. He didn't just change laws, he rewrote the entire legal landscape. Citizenship was granted to allies. Debt laws were tweaked to favor his veterans. Even the calendar was altered to reflect his power, with July carved into history in his honor. Each move was perfectly legal, yet each one eroded the Republic's foundations. The darkest irony, many of these reforms were popular. By funneling wealth and privileges to the masses, Caesar made himself untouchable, not through force alone, but through a veneer of legitimacy. The courts, once a check on power, became his stage. Judges who resisted were replaced. Trials against his allies mysteriously stalled. And when the Senate finally struck back with daggers on the Ides of March, they weren't just killing a man. They were trying and failing to kill the precedent he'd set. That law could be bent to serve one man's ambition. But here's the twist Rome never saw coming. Caesar's legal manipulations didn't die with him. They became the blueprint for every emperor who followed. Augustus would perfect the art, cloaking autocracy in senatorial decrees. Tiberius would weaponize treason trials to purge rivals. The lesson was clear. Once the law becomes a prop, tyranny wears a toga. And that, perhaps, was Caesar's most enduring victory, not conquering Gaul, but convincing Rome to surrender its justice, one statute at a time. The trial of Rabirius wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a political ambush disguised as justice. Picture this: an elderly senator, decades past his prime, suddenly dragged before a tribunal on charges of treason for an alleged crime committed 37 years earlier. The accusation, supposedly participating in the murder of a populist tribune back when Rome was a different world. But here's what made the trial surreal. Caesar and his allies didn't just revive an ancient law. They resurrected an archaic execution ritual, the duumviri perdulinis, a relic so old even the jurors struggled to remember its procedures. The courtroom became a stage for pure political theater. Witnesses were irrelevant, evidence was beside the point. The real script was written in the unspoken stakes. This was Caesar's opening salvo against the Senate's old guard. By reviving a forgotten legal process, he exposed the fragility of Rome's institutions. Every bizarre ritual, the flinging of spears, the solemn chanting, was a calculated mockery of tradition, designed to show who really held power. And then came the masterstroke. Midway through the farce, before a verdict could be reached, another tribune vetoed the proceedings. The case collapsed, but the damage was done. The message rang clear. The Senate's authority could be hollowed out from within, using the very laws meant to protect it. Rabirius, shaken but pardoned, faded into obscurity. Caesar walked away with something far more valuable: proof that Rome's legal system could be weaponized to humiliate his enemies without ever needing a conviction. What made this trial so chilling wasn't its outcome, but its brazen transparency. Unlike backroom deals or secret bribes, this was corruption performed in broad daylight, a spectacle meant to be seen and remembered. It set a precedent that would echo through the ages. When the law becomes a prop, justice is just another role to play, and in that realization lay the beginning of the end for the Republic. Because once courts become stages for political revenge, no one's safe, not even the men who built them. Augustus didn't just rule Rome, he staged it. The forum's courts, once battlegrounds for fiery orators, became his personal theater, where every verdict was a carefully scripted scene in the empire's grand narrative. Take the trial of Cassius Severus, a sharp-tongued writer whose real crime wasn't libel but audacity. He'd mocked Augustus's moral reforms, calling them hypocrisy draped in purple. The charge, not treason, not sedition, something far more insidious, diminishing the dignity of the state, a charge so vague it could silence anyone. The outcome was never in doubt. Severus was exiled, his books burned, his voice erased. But here's what chilled Rome: the trial wasn't held in shadows. It unfolded in full view, a spectacle meant to teach. This was Augustus's genius. He didn't abolish the courts, he hollowed them out. Judges were no longer impartial arbiters, they were actors reading from his script. High-profile cases were timed to coincide with festivals, ensuring maximum spectacle. Wealthy defendants accused of corruption would be paraded before crowds, only to receive improbably light sentences if they pledged loyalty. Meanwhile, the emperor's own allies enjoyed something new: legal immunity. A senator caught embezzling might walk free if he praised Augustus's reforms, while a shopkeeper stealing bread to feed his children faced the harshest penalties. The message was clear: justice wasn't blind, it blinked on cue. Augustus even revived archaic laws like those banning adultery to target political enemies. When his own daughter Julia was accused, the trial wasn't about morality. It was about demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice even family to the greater good. Her exile to a barren island served as the ultimate plot twist. No one was safe, not even the emperor's blood. Yet for all its ruthlessness, the system worked because it fed Rome's hunger for stability. After decades of civil war, people craved order, even if it came at the cost of truth. Augustus gave them a show of fairness, enough to sustain the illusion. But beneath the marble veneer, the law had become something far darker, a puppet show where the emperor held every string, and the audience, they didn't just watch. They learned to applaud. The death of Germanicus shocked Rome like a thunderclap. Here was the empire's golden boy, the beloved nephew of Emperor Tiberius, dead at 34 in a Syrian outpost, his body covered in strange bruises, his final words whispering of poison. Suspicion fell instantly on Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria and a man who'd openly feuded with Germanicus. But this wasn't just a murder trial, it was a powder keg of imperial intrigue, with Tiberius himself forced to preside over the spectacle. Piso's defense rested on a single, desperate claim. Germanicus had died of natural causes, and the rumors of foul play were whipped up by his enemies. Yet the evidence was damning. Witnesses described Piso's wife, Plancina, hosting secret meetings with poison experts. Servants testified about vials of liquid disappearing from Germanicus's chambers. Most damning of all, Piso had allegedly celebrated the news of Germanicus's death by sacrificing to the gods, a move that reeked of guilt. But here's where the trial twisted into something darker. The prosecution wasn't just arguing murder, they painted Piso as a traitor, claiming he'd incited mutiny among the legions to seize power. Tiberius played his part with chilling precision. He allowed the trial to proceed with all the pageantry of justice. Witnesses were called, speeches delivered, evidence presented, but Rome wasn't fooled. Everyone knew the verdict would hinge not on facts but on the emperor's unspoken will. When Piso realized Tiberius had abandoned him, he chose a final act of defiance, slitting his own throat before sentencing. His suicide note, a plea for his family's safety, and a thinly veiled accusation that Tiberius had orchestrated the whole affair. The aftermath was even more revealing. Plancina, Piso's wife, walked free after a personal intervention from Tiberius's mother, Livia. The message was unmistakable. Guilt and innocence meant nothing compared to imperial favor. The trial of Piso didn't just expose a murder, it laid bare the rot at the heart of Rome's legal system. When the emperor could bend justice to protect his allies or destroy his enemies, the courts were just another stage for power plays. And for ordinary Romans watching in the forum, the lesson was clear. In the shadow of the throne, the law was just another illusion. Sejanus climbed so high that Rome barely noticed when the ground beneath him crumbled. For years, he'd been Tiberius' shadow, commanding the Praetorian Guard, shaping policy, even positioning his own supporters in the Senate. Rumor swirled that Tiberius, aging and reclusive on Capri, planned to name him co-emperor. Then, in a single October night in 31 CE, everything unraveled. A secret letter arrived from the emperor, read aloud in the Senate not by Sejanus, but by his rival Macro. The words were polite, even warm, inviting Sejanus to a meeting to discuss greater honors, but the subtext was a death sentence. Guards seized him before he could react. The trial that followed was a grotesque parody of justice. No defense was permitted, no witnesses were called. The charges, treason, conspiracy, even an alleged plot to poison Tiberius' grandson, were so vague they could mean anything. The Senate, many of them Sejanus' own appointees, fell over themselves to condemn him, voting unanimously for execution before the sun set. But the real horror came after. Tiberius, ever the puppeteer, didn't just want Sejanus dead. He wanted him erased. The once mighty prefect was strangled in prison, his body dumped on the Germanian stairs where the mob tore it apart over 3 days. His children met worse fates. His young daughter, deemed too innocent for execution under Roman law, was raped before being killed because, as Tacitus chillingly records, no precedent allowed the strangling of a virgin. Yet the tragedy wasn't just Sejanus' downfall, it was what it revealed about Tiberius' Rome. The emperor had tolerated Sejanus' scheming for years, even his persecution of Germanicus' family. The sudden reversal wasn't about justice, it was about a tyrant's whim. Loyalty meant nothing, service meant nothing, even power was fleeting when paranoia dictated the rules. And the Senate's eager participation proved how thoroughly fear had rotted the system. They weren't jurors, they were survivors, scrambling to prove their obedience by destroying one of their own. The aftermath was a bloodbath. Sejanus' allies were hunted down in waves, their trials mere formalities. Some killed themselves upon hearing the news, knowing conviction was inevitable. Others begged for mercy, only to be mocked before execution. Tiberius, watching from Capri, let the purge drag on for years, as if cleansing Rome required endless sacrifice. But the lesson was etched in the forum stones long before the last body fell. Under an emperor who trusted no one was safe, not even the man who thought he'd mastered the game. Messalina didn't just wear the imperial purple, she wielded it like an executioner's blade. As Claudius' third wife, she transformed Rome's courts into her personal hunting grounds, where accusations were arrows and verdicts were death sentences. Her most brazen target, Julia Livilla, the striking noblewoman whose only crime was being a potential rival. No evidence was presented, no defense was permitted. Messalina simply whispered to Claudius that Julia plotted against him, and within hours the young woman was dragged from her home, exiled, and later executed on a barren island. The trial, if it could even be called that, lasted less time than a gladiator's match. But Julia was just one name on a growing list. Senators who slighted Messalina found themselves accused of treason. Wealthy widows who caught Claudius' eye mysteriously faced charges of adultery. Even freedmen who knew too much about her affairs were silenced under the guise of legal proceedings. The law wasn't a shield in Messalina's Rome, it was a noose tightened at her whim, and the Senate, cowed by her influence, played along, rubber-stamping verdicts they knew were lies. The irony was savage. When Messalina's own downfall came, it mirrored the very horrors she'd inflicted. her reckless affair with the senator Gaius Silius, and their rumored plot to overthrow Clodius was exposed not through a fair trial, but through the same web of palace intrigue she'd mastered. Clodius, trembling with rage, ordered her execution before she could even plead her case. The empress who'd turned justice into a puppet show became its final victim, dying in a garden as soldiers closed in, her last moments as swift and merciless as the fate she'd handed to others. What makes Messalina's story so chilling isn't just her cruelty, it's how perfectly she exposed the fragility of Roman law under the empire. With a whisper in the right ear, centuries of legal tradition could be reduced to a weapon for personal vendettas. And when the dust settled, no one mourned the system's collapse. They'd all been complicit, because in an empire where power flowed from the throne, justice was just another trophy for the taking. Seneca's death wasn't just an execution, it was a performance staged by Nero, with Rome's greatest philosopher cast in the role of sacrificial victim. The charges against him were flimsy at best, implicated in the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot to overthrow Nero that allegedly involved half the Senate. Never mind that Seneca, by then retired from politics, had spent years counseling restraint. Nero needed a spectacle, and who better than his former mentor to demonstrate the consequences of disloyalty? When the emperor's soldiers arrived at Seneca's villa with the order to die, the philosopher didn't plead or resist. He simply asked for parchment to write his will. Denied even that final dignity, he turned to his friends and delivered words that would echo through history. You see Nero's cruelty, and yet he murders his mother and his brother. The scene that followed was pure Stoic theater. Seneca, too weak from illness to slit his wrists effectively, endured a slow, agonizing death, drinking hemlock like Socrates, then sitting in a bath as his life ebbed away. But here's what unsettled Rome. His calm didn't just defy Nero, it exposed the emptiness of imperial power. A tyrant could command death, but he couldn't command fear. Seneca's final act, dictating letters on virtue as his body failed, wasn't surrender. It was defiance in its purest form, proving that philosophy could outshine even the mightiest sword. Yet for all its nobility, Seneca's death revealed a darker truth. However much his words inspired, they changed nothing. Nero's reign of terror continued unchecked. The courts, once forums for debate, now served only to rubber-stamp the emperor's whims. Even Rome's wisest hadn't been safe from their corruption. And that was the real tragedy. Seneca's stoicism might have been a moral victory, but it was a political failure. In the end, Nero didn't just kill a man. He proved that wisdom alone couldn't save Rome from itself. The law had become a puppet, and philosophy its last futile protest. The flames that engulfed Rome in 64 CE didn't just consume wooden tenements and marble temples, they devoured the last pretense of justice under Nero's reign. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire raged, reducing entire districts to smoldering ruins, while rumors swirled that the emperor himself had fiddled as the city burned. But when the smoke cleared, Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found one in Rome's most vulnerable community, the Christians. What followed wasn't a trial in any recognizable sense. It was a carnival of cruelty disguised as legal process. The charges were laughable on their face. Christians were accused not of arson, but of hatred of the human race, a vague smear that could mean anything. No evidence connected them to the fire's origin. No witnesses placed them at the scene. Instead, Nero relied on the public's superstitions and prejudices, painting these outsiders as secretive cultists who reveled in chaos. The trials were a mockery of Roman law. Defendants weren't allowed advocates, confessions were extracted through torture, sentences were decided before the first witness spoke. And the punishments, designed for maximum spectacle, Christians were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified and set ablaze as living torches to illuminate Nero's gardens. The Forum, once a symbol of order, became a stage for state-sanctioned slaughter. But here's what made this legal farce so sinister. Nero didn't just exploit existing laws, he twisted them into weapons. Roman jurisprudence had always allowed for harsh penalties, but only after proper procedure. By bypassing every safeguard, he set a lethal precedent. The law could be whatever the powerful declared it to be. And the Senate, desperate to appease a paranoid emperor, looked the other way. The aftermath reverberated far beyond Nero's reign. For the first time, Christianity was officially marked as a criminal movement, a label that would justify persecutions for centuries. More chillingly, the trials proved how easily a minority could be criminalized when public fear outweighed reason. The same tactics would later target Jews, philosophers, even rival political factions. Because once the courts become tools of vengeance, no one is safe from the next witch hunt. Yet amid the horror, an unexpected truth emerged. The very spectacle meant to erase Christianity only amplified it. Ordinary Romans, witnessing the courage of martyrs who sang hymns as they burned, began questioning the narrative. The fire Nero lit to destroy his enemies ended up igniting a faith that would outlast his empire. And that perhaps is the final irony of this dark chapter. The emperor who weaponized the law against the weak didn't realize he was signing his own verdict. Because injustice, no matter how brilliantly staged, always leaves ashes, and from ashes, new beginnings grow. The year of the four emperors didn't just tear Rome apart, it turned the courts into extensions of the battlefield. When Galba fell, then Otho, then Vitellius in rapid succession, each new ruler didn't just seize power, they weaponized the law to legitimize their shaky reigns. Vitellius, the gluttonous general who rose to power on the backs of his Rhine legions, understood something brutal. In times of chaos, trials aren't about justice. They're about survival. His first act, charging Otho's loyalists with treason, not because they'd committed crimes, but because their deaths would send a message. The evidence was irrelevant. Verdicts were preordained. Even the Senate, those supposed guardians of tradition, rubber-stamped executions to avoid joining the condemned. But the real perversion came with Vespasian. The shrewd general who emerged victorious didn't just punish enemies, he rewrote history through the courts. Supporters of Vitellius were retroactively branded as criminals, their property confiscated under laws hastily dusted off for the occasion. Yet here's the twist, Vespasian wasn't just settling scores. He was performing an elaborate pantomime of legality to convince Rome that order had returned. By holding trials, however sham, he created the illusion of due process, a veneer thin enough to see through but sturdy enough to pacify the masses. The darkest irony, both men used the same legal mechanisms to opposite ends. Vitellius wielded the courts like a club, openly rewarding informants who fabricated accusations. Vespasian, the future architect of stability, cloaked his retribution in procedure, knowing Rome would accept almost anything if it sounded official. The difference wasn't morality, it was marketing. Yet beneath the theatrics lay a terrifying truth. Without the steady hand of a unified state, the law became nothing more than a tool for the strongest faction. Judges took bribes not in secret but openly, knowing allegiances could shift overnight. Witnesses changed testimony to match whoever held the city that week. And the few who dared demand real justice, they vanished into the chaos, their voices drowned out by the marching boots of the next usurper. What made 69 CE so revealing wasn't just the violence, it was how quickly Rome's legal traditions crumbled when power changed hands at sword point. The courts, designed to temper human passions with reason, became mirrors reflecting the savagery outside their doors, and that lesson echoes far beyond antiquity. Because when the rule of law depends on who holds the army, justice is just another casualty of war. Domitian's reign began with a whisper of suspicion and ended in a chorus of screams. Unlike previous emperors who masked their tyranny behind legal formalities, Domitian dispensed with the pretense entirely. His courts weren't halls of justice, but slaughterhouses for anyone who drew his gaze. The charge was always the same: maiestas, treason against the state, but the definition expanded with his paranoia. A poorly timed joke, an ambiguous toast at a banquet, even an overly lavish hairstyle could mark a senator for death. The case of Agricola's family was typical in its cruelty. The famed general, celebrated for conquering Britain, had died years earlier, yet Domitian ordered his widow and daughter executed on suspicion of harboring resentment. Their real crime: refusing to praise the emperor loudly enough at public games. The trials themselves were grotesque pantomimes. Defendants were denied counsel. Witnesses were coerced into absurd confessions. One senator allegedly confessed to plotting rebellion by interpreting cloud formations. The Senate, cowed into compliance, voted condemnations while Domitian watched, his expression unreadable behind the facade of piety he cultivated. He styled himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and ruled as if divine wrath personified. Even his own cousin, Flavius Clemens, wasn't spared. Accused of atheism, a coded charge for sympathizing with Christians, Clemens was executed mere months after serving as consul. His sons, Domitian's own heirs, exiled and forgotten. Yet the darkest innovation of Domitian's reign wasn't the brutality, it was the bureaucracy of fear. He maintained detailed lists of enemies, updated daily by informants. Trials became administrative formalities, the verdicts etched into scrolls before the accused even entered the room. The sheer randomness of the terror was its most effective weapon. No one knew who would be next, so no one dared speak. Even silence became suspect. Tacitus later wrote of this era: Rome was a prison where the walls whispered. Domitian's downfall came as it had to. The very paranoia that sustained him eventually severed his last threads of loyalty. When his chamberlain, his wife, and even the Praetorian Guard conspired against him, the assassination was swift. A dagger thrust in his bedroom by servants who knew they'd be next if they hesitated. But the legacy of his reign outlasted the bloodstains on the palace floor. Future emperors would learn from his mistakes, cloaking their cruelties in softer rhetoric. The lesson was clear: terror could rule Rome, but only for a time, because when the law becomes a weapon of indiscriminate slaughter, even the executioners start measuring their own necks for the blade. Trajan's reign promised something Rome hadn't seen in decades: a return to fairness. When he took the throne in 98 CE, the courts were still reeling from Domitian's reign of terror, where verdicts had been dictated by paranoia rather than evidence. Trajan, a soldier emperor with a reputation for pragmatism, made a show of restoring dignity to the legal process. He dismissed informants who'd grown fat on false accusations, reinstated exiled senators, and even presided over trials himself, a stark contrast to Domitian's shadowy purges. But the letters between Trajan and Pliny the Younger, his governor in Bithynia, reveal the messy reality behind the reforms. Take the case of the Christians Pliny confronted. Unsure how to handle them, he wrote to Trajan for guidance. The emperor's reply was startlingly moderate: "Don't seek them out, but punish those who openly confess." No witch hunts, no torture to extract names. It was a far cry from Nero's blood-soaked spectacles. Yet here's the catch: Trajan still endorsed executions for those who refused to renounce their faith. His mercy had limits, and those limits were defined by political necessity. The message was clear: even a good emperor wouldn't tolerate challenges to Roman order, no matter how peaceful. And then there were the trials closer to home. A wealthy merchant caught bribing officials might escape with a fine if he had connections to Trajan's inner circle, while a provincial governor guilty of the same crime could face exile. The emperor's personal interventions often undermined his own reforms. When a senator was accused of extortion, Trajan famously declared, "I would rather spare a guilty man than condemn an innocent one." Noble words, but in practice, they meant the powerful often slipped through the cracks. The courts under Trajan weren't rigged like Domitian's, but justice still tilted toward those who could buy influence or curry favor. What makes this era so revealing isn't its failures, but its near misses. Trajan genuinely seemed to want a fairer system. He streamlined legal procedures, punished blatant corruption, and even funded orphanages for children of the condemned, a gesture unthinkable under his predecessors. Yet the machinery of Roman law, greased by centuries of privilege, resisted real change. The Senate, packed with aristocrats, still protected their own. Governors in distant provinces still ruled like petty kings, and the emperor, for all his good intentions, still wielded the final say over life and death. Trajan's legacy isn't one of triumph or hypocrisy, it's something more human. He proved that even the most well-meaning ruler couldn't overhaul a system built on inequality. The courts might be cleaner, but they were never clean, and that tension between idealism and reality would haunt Rome long after his death, because when justice depends on the virtue of one man, it's only ever a temporary victory. The moment he's gone, the old shadows creep back in. Hadrian walked a tightrope between reform and autocracy on one side, the dream of a legal system so clear even a peasant could understand it. On the other, the reality that emperors rarely bound themselves by their own rules. His greatest legacy, the Perpetual Edict, wasn't just a collection of laws, it was an attempt to tame the chaos of centuries. For the first time, Rome's jumble of senatorial decrees, praetorian rulings, and imperial whims were condensed into a single code standardized across the empire. Provincial governors could no longer invent penalties on a whim. Precedents mattered, consistency was promised, but here's the twist: Hadrian's obsession with order didn't extend to his own court. Take the trial of the 4 ex-consuls, a scandal that laid bare the limits of legal reform. These senators were accused of conspiracy, a charge as vague as it was deadly. Hadrian, ever the micromanager, intervened personally. 2 were acquitted after groveling before him. A third, deemed insufficiently humble, was exiled. The 4th, executed without trial, his property seized by the imperial treasury. The Perpetual Edict might have demanded due process, but Hadrian proved that when power clashed with principle, power always won. Even his architectural projects betrayed this duality. While his legal code sought to unify, his lavish villa at Tivoli celebrated excess, a private playground where imported marble and stolen Egyptian obelisks flaunted his untouchable status. The message was unmistakable: laws were for others, emperors existed above them. Yet for all its flaws, Hadrian's codification planted seeds that would outlast him. Future jurists like Ulpian and Gaius built on his work, crafting principles that still underpin modern law. The irony: these scholars often met violent ends, victims of the very system they tried to refine. Hadrian's legacy wasn't a perfect system. It was the revelation that no code, no matter how brilliant, could purify justice while emperors still played God. The law could be written down, but power, that remained unwritten. Marcus Aurelius ruled with a philosopher's mind but an emperor's burdens, a tension that played out dramatically in Rome's courtrooms. On one hand, here was a man who wrote in his meditations that justice was the source of all other virtues, who pardoned senators caught plotting against him, arguing that mercy strengthened the state more than vengeance. When the notorious informer Herodes Atticus was brought before him, accused of corruption, Aurelius didn't order execution or exile. He fined him lightly, then quipped, "Forgiveness is the revenge of the wise." To the Senate's shock, this was an emperor who seemed to genuinely believe in fairness. Yet the same man who showed clemency to conspirators presided over the brutal persecution of Christians. In Lyon, during his reign, believers were tortured in the public square, their limbs broken, their flesh seared by hot irons, all while provincial officials cited imperial decrees against atheism, the charge leveled at those who refused to worship Roman gods. The contradiction cuts deep. How could a thinker who penned lines like, "What injures the hive injures the bee," sanction such cruelty? The answer lies in the gap between personal ethics and political necessity. To Aurelius, Christianity wasn't just a religion, it was a threat to the Pax Romana, a movement that undermined social order by rejecting the gods who supposedly protected the empire. His justice, however philosophical, bowed to the demands of stability. The trial of the senator Priscus lays bare this duality. Accused of treason, Priscus faced Aurelius directly in the forum. Instead of immediate condemnation, the emperor allowed a full defense, even entertaining Priscus' argument that criticism wasn't disloyalty, it was a citizen's duty. The Senate, accustomed to swift executions, watched in disbelief as Aurelius acquitted him, declaring, "A ruler who fears dissent fears his own shadow." Yet months later, when a group of Christians in Rome openly defied an order to sacrifice to Jupiter, the same emperor authorized their execution without hesitation. The difference: Priscus played by Rome's rules, the Christians did not. What makes Aurelius' reign so haunting isn't the hypocrisy, it's the sincerity. He wasn't a tyrant rationalizing brutality. He was a true believer trapped in a system where ideals crumbled under the weight of power. His writings reveal a man tormented by the compromises of rule, once confessing, "The higher we rise, the more we must bend." In the end, his courts became mirrors of that struggle, islands of reason in some cases, instruments of repression in others, and perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of his legal legacy. Even the noblest minds can't purify justice when the throne itself corrupts. The law, after all, is only as virtuous as the hands that wield it. Commodus didn't just distort justice, he turned it into a grotesque carnival where the law bowed to spectacle, and the courtroom became a slaughterhouse. Picture this: the emperor, dressed in a gladiator's leather armor, perched on a gilded throne in the Colosseum, thumbs flicking up or down not for fighters, but for senators dragged into the sand to plead their cases. One wrong word, one hesitant glance, and they'd find themselves handed a wooden sword, forced to duel professional killers for the crowd's amusement. Trials under Commodus weren't about evidence or precedent. They were about survival, and the only rule was the emperor's whim. Take the fate of the senator Quintus Junius Rusticus. His crime: refusing to praise Commodus as the Roman Hercules during a Senate meeting. The charge was treason, but the trial was pure theater. Rusticus, an elderly scholar with no combat experience, was shoved into the arena against a hulking secutor armed with a razor-sharp trident. The crowd roared as the old man stumbled, his pleas drowned out by the jeers of spectators who knew the outcome before the first blow landed. That was the point. Justice wasn't just corrupted under Commodus, it was weaponized to humiliate. Meanwhile, actual criminals thrived. A notorious gang leader named Cleander, Commodus' own chamberlain, openly sold pardons from the palace steps. Murderers and thieves walked free if their coin was heavy enough, while innocent men died for the sin of boring the emperor. The legal system, already weakened by a century of imperial abuse, now functioned as an extension of Commodus' delusions. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's supposed protectors, became enforcers of his madness, arresting citizens on fabricated charges just to fill the arena's docket. The darkest irony, Commodus saw himself as Rome's savior. In his twisted mind, these spectacles weren't just entertainment, they were moral lessons. By punishing the ungrateful and rewarding the loyal, he believed he was purging weakness from the empire. But the real lesson was far uglier. When justice becomes a game, no one is safe. Not the senators, not the citizens, not even the emperor himself. Commodus' reign ended as it had to, with a dagger in the dark wielded by those who'd finally had enough. But the damage outlasted him. The courts, once symbols of order, had been exposed as hollow shells. The Senate, stripped of dignity, would never fully recover. And the people, they'd learned a bitter truth that law without fairness is just violence in a toga. The spectacle was over, but the stage had been set for chaos. Because when you teach men that justice is a joke, don't be surprised when they stop laughing. Septimius Severus didn't just rule Rome, he turned its courts into a family enterprise. When he seized power in 193 CE, the legal system was already bruised by decades of imperial meddling, but the Severans didn't just bend justice to their will, they industrialized it. Take the case of the wealthy Senator Gaius Fulvius Plautianus, Severus' own Praetorian prefect. One day, he was the emperor's closest confidant, showered with honors. The next, he was dragged before a tribunal accused of plotting assassination. The evidence, a single informant, likely bribed by Severus' wife, Julia Domna, who saw Plautianus as a rival. The trial lasted less than an hour. Plautianus was executed, his vast estates absorbed into the imperial treasury, a pattern that would define the dynasty. Julia Domna's influence in the courts was unprecedented for an empress. She didn't just whisper in her husband's ear, she presided over hearings like a judge, her voice carrying the weight of law. When a group of Alexandrian merchants were accused of tax evasion, she overruled the presiding magistrate, demanding their property be seized rather than fined. The real crime, their ships competed with her family's trading interests. Under Severus, justice wasn't blind, it was personal, a tool to reward allies and crush anyone who threatened the dynasty's grip. But it was their son Caracalla who perfected legalized theft. His infamous Constitutio Antoniniana, granting citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, wasn't some grand humanitarian gesture, it was a tax grab. By expanding citizenship, he expanded the pool of people subject to inheritance taxes, and when that wasn't enough, he turned trials into shakedowns. Wealthy landowners would suddenly find themselves accused of obscure religious violations or treasonous gossip. The penalty, confiscation of their estates. One particularly brazen case involved a Gallic nobleman whose only crime was owning vineyards near imperial property. Caracalla's verdict: the land belongs to Rome, meaning himself. The Severans' legacy wasn't just corruption, it was systematization. They didn't break the courts, they monetized them. Verdicts became invoices, judges became accountants. And the law, just another ledger in the imperial treasury. When Severus supposedly advised his sons on his deathbed, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, scorn all others," he wasn't just talking about politics. He was revealing the dynasty's true motto: justice pays if you're the one holding the scales. Elagabalus didn't just ignore Roman law, he turned it into a circus act. At 14, he became emperor not through merit but because his grandmother's scheming and the army's superstition about his supposed divine connection to the sun god Elagabalus. From the moment he entered Rome in a procession of Syrian priests and exotic dancers, it was clear tradition meant nothing to him, his first legal reform. Declaring his charioteer, a man named Hierocles, not just his lover but a consul and judge. Imagine the outrage as this uneducated stable hand presided over cases in the forum, handing down verdicts based on whim rather than precedent, while the emperor giggled from the sidelines. Then came the marriages, each more scandalous than the last. Elagabalus defied centuries of religious law by wedding a Vestal virgin, Aquilia Severa, a union considered sacrilege punishable by death. When priests protested, he simply shrugged and declared himself above such petty rules. But his most brazen stunt was the trial of his own image. He ordered a court convened to judge whether his golden portrait, draped in silks and perfumed with exotic oils, deserved more honors than Rome's ancient gods. Senators were forced to argue the case with straight faces while the emperor lounged on a podium, tossing grapes at those who displeased him. The real tragedy wasn't just the absurdity, it was the erosion of trust. When Elagabalus appointed his barber as head of the grain supply or his dancer as a provincial governor, he wasn't just mocking tradition, he was proving that the law could be twisted beyond recognition. Wealthy citizens suddenly found their property confiscated because the emperor fancied their exotic pets. Military veterans were stripped of pensions to fund his lavish parties. And through it all, the Senate, cowed by fear or bribes, rubber-stamped every decree. Yet beneath the spectacle lay a darker truth. Elagabalus wasn't just a spoiled teen. He was the product of a system already rotten to the core. By his time, emperors had spent centuries treating the law as a personal plaything. He simply took it to its logical extreme, exposing what happened when power had no boundaries. The courts didn't just lose their dignity under his reign, they became a punchline, and when the Praetorian Guard finally murdered him at 18, stuffing his body into a sewer, the message was clear. Rome could tolerate many things, but not a ruler who made justice laughable. The tragedy, the damage outlived him. After Elagabalus, no one could pretend the law was sacred. It was just another toy, one every future emperor would feel entitled to break. Alexander Severus inherited an empire where the courts had become little more than extensions of imperial whimsy, first under the erratic Elagabalus, then further eroded by decades of Severan greed. At just 13 years old, he faced an impossible task, restoring faith in a legal system that had been mocked, bought, and bloodied. His approach was earnest, even noble. He reinstated respected jurists like Ulpian to oversee the courts, banning the sale of verdicts and requiring judges to cite actual laws rather than personal preference. For a fleeting moment, it seemed Rome might remember what justice looked like. Then reality crashed in. The Praetorian Guard, accustomed to profiting from bribes and intimidation, bristled at the reforms. When Ulpian dared to punish one of their own for extorting a senator, the soldiers stormed his house and butchered him in front of Alexander's horrified mother, Julia Mamaea. The emperor, too young and inexperienced to command real authority, could only watch as his ideals turned to ashes. The message was unmistakable. In Rome, power flowed from the sword, not the gavel. What makes Alexander's failure so tragic isn't just the wasted potential, it's how vividly it exposed the rot beneath the surface. Even well-intentioned reforms crumbled when the enforcers of the law were its worst offenders. Provincial governors, sensing weakness, resumed their predatory ways. One particularly egregious case in Gaul saw a wealthy widow stripped of her estate by a corrupt magistrate who simply declared her late husband's will invalid. When she appealed to Rome, the case vanished into bureaucratic oblivion, a telling sign of how little the emperor's decrees meant beyond the capital. The final insult came in 235 CE, when Alexander's own troops turned on him. Annoyed by his attempts to curb their excesses and his refusal to let them pillage Germanic villages, the legions murdered him and his mother in their tent, proclaiming the brutish Maximinus Thrax as emperor instead. With that act, the last facade of legal order collapsed entirely. The crisis of the 3rd century had begun a 50-year freefall where emperors rose and fell by the sword. Laws were discarded like battlefield debris, and the courts became afterthoughts in an empire too busy surviving to pretend at justice. Alexander's reign stands as a grim lesson. No code of laws, no matter how carefully crafted, can withstand the weight of systemic corruption. When those sworn to uphold justice care more for profit than principle, even the noblest reforms are doomed. And Rome, by then, was far past caring. Diocletian's reign began with promises of stability, a return to Rome's old gods and traditions after decades of chaos. But by 303 CE, his vision of order had turned into a war against an unexpected enemy, the growing Christian minority. Unlike previous emperors who targeted Christians sporadically, Diocletian orchestrated his persecution with chilling precision, turning the courts into machines of conformity. His first edict ordered the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the arrest of clergy. But it was the second edict that revealed the true scope of his plan, imprisoning every Christian who refused to recant, subjecting them to public trials designed not just to punish, but to humiliate. Take the case of Felix, a bishop hauled before a tribunal in North Africa. The magistrate didn't just demand he renounce his faith, he staged the trial as a spectacle, offering Felix lavish rewards in front of a jeering crowd. When Felix refused, the sentence was swift: exile to a remote mining camp, a fate meant to break both body and spirit. Yet here's what Diocletian failed to grasp. These public trials didn't terrify Christians into submission, they galvanized them. Stories of martyrs like Felix spread like wildfire, their defiance immortalized in secret letters passed between congregations. The very system meant to erase Christianity became its megaphone. Even more telling were the legal loopholes that backfired. To avoid outright executions which risked creating martyrs, judges often imposed punishments like forced labor or confiscation of property. But this half measure allowed Christians to survive and organize. In the mines of Sardinia, exiled believers turned prison camps into underground seminaries, teaching the faith to new converts. Wealthy Christians who lost their estates found refuge in the homes of sympathizers, creating networks of resistance. Diocletian's laws, for all their brutality, couldn't account for the tenacity of belief. The final irony, the persecution's collapse mirrored its failures. When Diocletian abdicated in 305 CE, his successors quickly realized the crackdown was unsustainable. Galerius, once its fiercest advocate, issued an edict of toleration on his deathbed, admitting the campaign had only strengthened Christianity's appeal. The courts, designed to enforce unity, had instead exposed the limits of state power, because when laws clash with something as unyielding as faith, no verdict, no matter how harsh, can ever be the final word. Diocletian's persecution didn't just fail. It proved that injustice, dressed in legal robes, still trembles before the courage of those who refuse to kneel. Constantine's conversion to Christianity wasn't just a personal epiphany. It was a legal earthquake that reshaped Rome's courts from the ground up. Overnight, laws that had persecuted Christians for generations were scrapped, replaced by edicts granting them unprecedented privileges. Churches reclaimed confiscated property, clergy were exempted from taxes and civic duties. Even Sunday, once an ordinary workday, was declared a day of rest in honor of the Christian Sabbath. But beneath these reforms lay a thorny question: was this true justice or just favoritism wearing a cross? Take the case of the Donatists, a North African Christian sect deemed heretical by Constantine's advisors. When they refused to accept bishops appointed by Rome, the emperor didn't just excommunicate them, he weaponized the courts. Donatist churches were seized, their leaders hauled before magistrates on charges of disturbing the peace, a vague accusation that could mean anything from preaching to refusing imperial decrees. The verdicts were harsh: exile, fines, even forced labor in state mines. The irony was staggering. Christians who'd survived Diocletian's persecution now found themselves persecuted by their own, with the same legal machinery once used against them now turned inward. Yet Constantine's revolution wasn't solely about repression. His legal code, the Theodosian Compilation, introduced groundbreaking protections for the vulnerable. Abandoned infants could no longer be left to die. They were to be taken in by the state or local churches. Slave owners faced new restrictions on cruelty, including a ban on separating families during sales. Even prisoners gained rights, with judges required to review cases annually to prevent indefinite detention. These reforms reflected Christian ideals of mercy, but they also exposed a paradox. The same emperor who preached compassion could be ruthless in enforcing orthodoxy. The most lasting change, though, was subtler. By intertwining church and state, Constantine created a system where religious allegiance became a legal advantage. Bishops were granted authority to arbitrate civil disputes, their rulings backed by imperial force. Christian litigants suddenly found their testimony weighted more heavily than pagans in court. And when disputes arose over doctrine, it wasn't philosophers but the emperor himself who summoned councils like Nicaea to settle them with dissenters branded as criminals. The law, once a secular tool, now carried divine sanction. What makes Constantine's reign so pivotal isn't just the laws he passed, but the precedent he set. That faith could dictate legal standing. Future emperors would expand this model, persecuting pagans with the same fervor once reserved for Christians. The courts, meant to uphold impartial justice, became battlegrounds for theological conformity. And that legacy, perhaps, is the most complex of all, because when the scales of justice tilt toward heaven, someone always ends up crushed beneath them. Priscillian's trial wasn't just a verdict, it was a turning point where faith and law became a lethal cocktail. The Spanish bishop, known for his ascetic lifestyle and unorthodox teachings, had drawn suspicion for years. His followers, the Priscillianists, rejected marriage, embraced vegetarianism, and held secret nighttime gatherings that rumors painted as a cult. But what began as theological squabbles escalated when rival bishops, led by the powerful Aethatius of Osanuba, weaponized Rome's legal machinery against him. The charge, not just heresy but maleficium, witchcraft. The trial, held in Trier under Emperor Magnus Maximus, was supposed to be a religious inquiry. Instead, it became a spectacle of imperial force. The prosecution's tactics were brutal. Priscillian and his followers were tortured, their confessions extracted under duress. When they admitted to studying strange doctrines and praying nude practices twisted by Aethatius into evidence of devil worship, the outcome was sealed. But here's what stunned contemporaries. Secular authorities, not the church, carried out the execution. Priscillian and 6 companions were beheaded, their property confiscated by the state. For the first time, Rome's swordsmen enforced orthodoxy, blurring the line between spiritual correction and state-sanctioned murder. Even critics like St. Martin of Tours, who pleaded for mercy, recoiled at the precedent. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Priscillian's death didn't erase his movement, it martyred him. Followers smuggled his writings across Gaul and Hispania, their underground networks thriving precisely because of the crackdown. Meanwhile, the church fractured. Prominent bishops like Ambrose of Milan condemned the trial, warning that mixing theology with capital punishment would corrupt both. Their fears proved prophetic. Within decades, heresy trials multiplied, their procedures borrowed from Roman treason laws. The scaffolding of the Inquisition was being built, brick by bloody brick. Yet the trial's darkest legacy wasn't its violence, it was the blueprint it provided. By fusing religious dogma with imperial power, Priscillian's accusers created a template future rulers would exploit. Charlemagne would use it against Saxon pagans, medieval popes would deploy it against Cathars. The message was clear: deviation from doctrine wasn't just error, it was treason. And once that idea took root, no dissent was safe. Priscillian's real crime wasn't heresy. It was proving how easily faith could be weaponized by those who claimed to defend it. By the 5th century, Rome's courts were little more than crumbling stages for a dying empire's last act. The forum's marble steps, once polished by the sandals of orators and jurors, now cracked under the boots of barbarian mercenaries. Trials still occurred, but the verdicts meant nothing. Take the farce of Petronius Maximus, the senator who briefly seized the throne in 455 CE. When a Vandal warlord demanded his daughter's hand in marriage, the emperor convened a tribunal to debate the matter. The senators dutifully voted to refuse, only for Maximus to ignore their decision and hand her over anyway. The law had become theater, its scripts written by whoever held the sword. The Visigoths under Alaric didn't even bother with pretense. After sacking Rome in 410, they appointed their own chieftains as judges, dismissing Roman magistrates outright. Cases were settled not with scrolls of precedent, but with the weight of a warrior's reputation. A land dispute between two nobles might end with a brawl in the forum's ruins. The victor declared right by default. And when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476, the Germanic king Odoacer didn't abolish the courts, he simply stopped filling the vacancies. Rome's legal system didn't collapse, it withered from neglect like a vine starved of water. Yet amid the decay, flickers of the old order survived. In Ravenna, the final capital, clerks still copied legal texts long after they were enforceable. Some provincial governors, clinging to tradition, held hearings under crumbling porticos, but the rot ran too deep. Corruption, always present, now went unchecked. A widow seeking justice for her stolen vineyard might bribe a judge, only to watch him pocket the coins and rule for her richer opponent. The great irony. The barbarians who dismantled Rome's power often admired its laws. Theoderic the Ostrogoth, ruling Italy in the early 6th century, kept Roman statutes on the books, not out of reverence, but because even conquerors needed rules to govern. The forum's silence was the loudest testament to Rome's fall. Where Cicero had once swayed juries with his rhetoric, weeds now grew between the paving stones. The law courts, once temples of order, stood empty or repurposed. One became a stable, another a blacksmith's forge, but the legacy of Roman justice refused to die. In distant monasteries, monks painstakingly preserved legal texts. Byzantine emperors would later revive Justinian's codification, and centuries after the last Western verdict was uttered, medieval kings would still invoke Roman precedents to legitimize their rule. The courts had fallen, but the idea they represented, that society could be bound by shared rules, not just brute force, would outlast the empire itself. Because when the gavel finally fell on Rome, it wasn't the end of justice. It was the passing of a torch, however dimly it flickered, into the darkness of a new age. The echoes of Rome's courtroom dramas aren't confined to history books. They resonate in every modern courthouse, from the marble halls of supreme courts to the fluorescent lit chambers of small-town tribunals. Take the jury system, a concept Rome didn't invent but refined into something startlingly familiar. The Quaestions Perpetui, permanent courts staffed by citizen jurors, laid the groundwork for peer judgment. Yet Rome's jurors weren't impartial observers, they were often wealthy elites bribed with lavish dinners or political favors, a reminder that the veneer of fairness has always been fragile. Sound familiar? Even today, jury selection can become a battleground of bias, where demographics and psychology shape outcomes as much as evidence. Legal language itself is steeped in Roman tradition. Phrases like habeas corpus, produce the body, pro bono, for the good, and subpoena, under penalty, aren't just Latin flourishes. They're fossils of a system that wrestled with the same dilemmas we face. When a modern lawyer invokes circumstantial evidence, they're channeling Cicero's tactics against Vez, where stolen statues became silent witnesses. But here's the unsettling parallel. Rome's courts also perfected the art of weaponizing language. Charges like Maius's treason were stretched to punish everything from satire to awkward silences at banquets. Today's broad statutes, think conspiracy or racketeering, can be just as elastic in the wrong hands. The darkest threads of Roman justice, though, are the ones that never frayed. Political trials, where verdicts were decided before the first witness spoke, find their mirror in modern show trials where dissidents face predetermined fates. The persecution of Christians under Nero, scapegoated for a fire they didn't start, echoes in the rush to blame marginalized groups during crises and the corruption. It didn't end with sacks of gold changing hands in the Forum. Lobbyists and dark money have simply replaced toga-clad bribe takers, proving that power always finds a way to tilt the scales. Yet Rome's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a blueprint for vigilance. The Republic's fall began when citizens stopped trusting the courts to be fair. Today, when public faith in justice wavers, whether over racial disparities in sentencing or the influence of wealth on outcomes, we're replaying Rome's final act. The difference: we still have time to rewrite the ending, because the law isn't just rules and precedent, it's a living thing shaped by who fights for it. And that's a lesson worth remembering.